Yeah, before we get started, let's just, I know you guys have been praying for me, but one of the things I've been praying for is actually for you guys. Because while I will take as much prayer as I possibly can, what I really wanted was for God to use my words to soften your heart. Lord, I thank you for just this amazing opportunity. I thank you for the wisdom to not only hear, but to follow your words, Lord. And I thank you that you've been preparing the hearts of the people that have not only shown up today, but who are also watching online and going to be listening online. Lord, I pray that you could use my humble and meager words to change the direction of somebody's future. Lord, give me a clarity of mind and a clarity of my words and a willingness to not be affected or to look to somebody else for an opinion of who I am. I have a habit, I don't know if you guys know, I was a youth pastor for about 2 years. I've spoken a lot of times, and I have a habit of preparing a message based on what people have told me, right? Which is, you have a nice takeoff, you get 3 points in a poem, something nice and a nice landing. And what I'm used to is going through weeks of prep time and having this beautiful message laid out and God saying at the last minute, you know what, we're going to put that aside and we're going to talk about this. And I don't like that because what that does, I like to be in control. I love to be in control of my actions. And God forces me out of that box to follow Him. And that's really uncomfortable for those of us who want to look good and to be good and to not appear foolish. But it's not about me. I've also made a habit out of being willing instead of qualified. So, where to begin on that one? I have had more careers than anybody else I know. Probably, I can almost guarantee, more than anybody else in this room. So, part of that comes with getting used to a steep learning curve. I started off working as a cashier and a stock person in a store. I've done everything from being an apprentice pipe fitter and welder for 3 years, working in the oil patch, to going from that into full-time ministry. I went from that to working for the government of Alberta as a consultation coordinator, dealing with logistics and planning, and got to be a fly on the wall as I sat in on First Nations meetings. We've been in rooms where people have threatened to scalp us, which, let me tell you, that was really very interesting because I've never faced or seen hostility in that aspect. And to watch people who aren't necessarily qualified, but are willing to fit the role. And I've learned a lot from that, because it's not necessarily about having earned where you are. It's about being willing to step out in faith and letting God get the result. Now, I went from that to becoming a project scheduler in Nisku for another 3 years before I started my own business doing writing and editing. So I've done everything from physical labor to welding to preaching to now, currently, I'm an arborist. So I deal with a lot of trees. I'm climbing and everything from planting to pruning to removal. So today I think I'm going to talk to you a little bit about God's perspective, because whether you've seen us or not, if you've ever watched somebody prune a tree, it's a really beautiful perspective to sit in the middle of a tree overlooking a park. And I do that all the time. It's fantastic. It's a beautiful Zen place to be. And when I first started talking to God about what He wanted me to say today, He gave me two options, totally polar opposite. And He's like, I want you to talk about both. I'm like, okay, God, that's a little strange because they're not related. How do you tie them together? And He's like, well, you'll figure it out. Oh, I hate that answer. I hate that answer. I dislike it. Yeah. It's all good. Perspective is a beautiful thing. The real world definition of perspective is what I can physically see with my eyes. Because that's what we can measure. That's what we can look at. But have you ever wondered what God's perspective is on life? It's, I assure you, far greater. Statistically, you only see approximately 38% of everything around you, right? That's, when I'm looking at you, I probably can't tell that there's a $20 bill in one of the envelopes over here, right? Because I can't see it. It's out of my scope. It's out of my perspective. I think I'm jumping ahead of myself, but that's okay. In all of my wandering around, in my learning curve of doing a whole bunch of different things, things get very, very interesting when I follow God, because I've done both ways. Now, the video you saw talking about, for those of you who are saved between 4 and 14, that's the greatest number of people. I'm not one of those. I'm one of the rare few. I think I was 21 when people started asking me questions that I didn't have an answer to. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I didn't really struggle with the concept of God until I was about 21. And I can thank my beautiful wife for that, because unwittingly she was a missionary bride, even though she wasn't really following it at the time. Every couple of months she would feel guilty and she'd want to go to church. And I was like, free coffee and good music, I'm okay with that. That sounds fine for me. But things get very, very interesting when you follow God, because it creates opportunity. Now, I've said it earlier, I've spent a lot of time being willing to do things, but not qualified. Here's a good example. When I was an apprentice welder, we had a missionary come to our church, and he asked the question, what does God want you to do with your life? And I struggled with that, because up until that moment, prayer was a one-way conversation with God. And when he asked that question, it was like, you mean God actually responds? Like, I can have a conversation with him and he'll give me an answer? That blew my mind. It was a beautiful week. And what I felt at the time was God wanted me to get into youth ministry. Had no idea how to do that. That's fine. I planned it out, used strategy in my mind, and kind of thought, okay, well, that means we have to probably move to Edmonton, because Cold Lake, Alberta doesn't have any kind of a college or anything like that deals in youth ministry. So talked over with my wife. We moved from Cold Lake to Edmonton. I transferred with the company I was with at the time. At that point, I was an apprentice welder, and I chose to become an apprentice pipe fitter, working here in Edmonton. We were building prefab mods. And I thought, okay, God, I trust you to make a way. And in my mind, it was like, okay, well, we'll move to Edmonton. We're gonna go through the process. I'll go to school. We'll figure out finances. We'll deal with all of the hoops. And at some point in my life, I'm going to be a youth pastor. Well, we were here probably, I want to say, a year. And it seemed like the longer we were here, the further away that vision got. And I really struggled with that because in my perception, I wasn't following God. Sorry, guys, that stirred something up. That is good. Anyway, so at the time, we were about 1,200 tradesmen building prefab mods in a massive, 2-block mod yard. And at the time, we went through a political change. We lost a lot of our contracts. And after each crew would kind of run out of work, they would take 1 or 2 guys that they liked, and then they would lay off the rest. Unlike this previous kind of move of politics and everything else, it wasn't, we're going to lay off 500 guys at once. It was like 10, 15 a week. And, we slowly whittled it down. And at the time, I was part of the last 20 guys that was working there. So from 1,250 down to 20. And for 3 weeks, I swept floors. It was like, that's okay, they're paying me, I'm happy, I'm just going to sweep floors, and if they want to pay me that kind of money, then that's fine. And then, okay, well, we now have no more work, we're just going to lay everybody off, and we're just going to shut down the shop. That's fine. So I was like, okay, we've got a little pot of money, I'm going to take a month off and do some home renovations, and then I'll go back to work. Whatever. So took a month off, did some home renovations. Then I started handing out resumes. Now, logically in my mind, I probably wasn't thinking of the fact that there was about 1,250 guys that had been laid off just before I did, and whether it was God's hand or whether it was just an equation of people moving around. By the time I started to go back to work, I handed out over 100 resumes, and I've never had a problem finding a job. But I handed out over 100 resumes, and I got 2 callbacks. One was to tell me that, sorry, the position has been filled and we're no longer interested. I've never actually received a call back for somebody like that to tell me that, I didn't get the job. That was random. The other one was to say, well, we don't have full-time work, but we can toss you a little bit of hours. That's fine. And in the middle of this, so I was off work for about 5 months. Now, we had bought a home here in Edmonton. At that point, we had responsibilities. We didn't have kids, but we had these responsibilities and a debt of weight. And so I was off work. Bills were getting tight. We were getting to a point where we weren't starting to make payments because we couldn't afford to. And I was really getting frustrated because God was supposed to be in control of my life. And I didn't feel like a success. I didn't feel like I was where I should have been. And I was getting angry because I didn't feel in control. And so I was just praying, just like David did in the Psalms. God is a big God. He can take, when you're angry at him, he's not going to be offended if you're calling him names and angry, because he's full of grace and he can take it. And so that's, in that moment of where I was, God said, okay, now you're ready. And that drove me nuts because I was like, okay, well, ready for what? This was like a Friday or a Saturday. And so anyway, we showed up to church on Sunday. And at this point, I hadn't talked to the senior pastor. I hadn't told him about our life plan or anything else. And he pulled me aside after the service, and he's like, how would you like to get into youth ministry? And I'm like, that was totally out of left field. Number one, well, I can't do that because I need to find a job. I need to support my family. I need to pay my bills. I need to do all of these things that the world tells me I have to do. And he's like, well, no, I don't think you understand. We want to pay you to do full-time ministry. You can do that? Like, I haven't been to school. I'm a new Christian. I'd only been a Christian for a couple of years. And he's like, well, we'll work on the details and we'll kind of, we'll work on it like an apprenticeship. You come and do youth ministry, we'll pay you and we'll teach you how to do that. And I was like, okay. Totally not the way I thought it would go, but God, is this the door that you're opening? Is this what you want us to do? And God said, yes. Like, okay, sounds good. We'll take a 50% pay cut from what I was used to making to follow what we thought at the time God was leading. And I guarantee you it was what God had in plan. But it didn't seem like it because I was out of control. I was not trained. I was not equipped. I was just willing. And so after a few months of being at this church, our senior pastor, who was the only other full-time paid minister, took a stress sabbatical, not because of me. It's okay. And stepped out of ministry full-time, leaving me as the only full-time paid minister. Now, how many of you have ever felt uncomfortable doing something that you thought you weren't equipped for? I was way over my head. And thankfully, we had a bunch of amazing deacons and very mature Christians that were able to come together and help so that I wasn't alone. And God was all over that place. Did we thrive? No, probably not. But we survived. And God did some amazing things through that. And so by the time we found a senior pastor to take control, at that point, we no longer had enough income to cover 2 positions. And it was like, okay, God, that was fun. They'd given me 6 weeks notice of that this position wasn't going to last. And it was like, okay, that was really fun. What's next? And what I felt in my spirit was this move towards government and politics. Now, I've never worked for a government up until that point. I had no idea how it operated. I didn't even know where to start. I had lots of opportunity when I was growing up. My parents basically said, we'll pay half of whatever schooling you want to do, and you pay the other half. I never took them up on that because I never knew what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I got to this point of, okay, well, I kind of feel like government and politics is the direction we're moving. What I would love to see is me in a position where I can see how the Alberta government functions and operates from behind the scenes. And God said, well, you should take so-and-so out for coffee. Like, he's the only guy that I know that works for the Alberta government. Sounds good, that works for me. So I took him out for coffee and I said, this is my heart. This is what I feel God is leading. And I just want to follow God. I want to honor Him in whatever I'm doing. And he's like, well, I have an interesting proposal for you. So at the time, it was for a group called the Land Use Secretariat. It was just started. And it was the government's response to saying, we want to do long-term development planning for the entire province, and we want all of the different ministries to work together on one page. So if you've ever put about 12 cats in a room, you know that generally doesn't work very well. And so what I wanted to see was kind of like the inner workings of a clock. I wanted to see how all the cogs turned, and I wanted to see how everything kind of operated and moved. And what God opened the door to was another position that I wasn't qualified for, but that I was willing to do. And again, way out of my comfort zone. But it went from, working at a church to working in a government office, dealing in consultation and coordinating, in sending out news releases, in meeting with all of these First Nations groups to talk about, we want to hear your opinion on what land planning should be. We want to see what direction is coming from you so that we can incorporate that in all of these different things. And it was absolutely fantastic because, number one, I never would have even thought that a position like this existed. In all of my mind, nothing like this would have ever come close, and yet it was exactly what I had hoped for and wanted. And I did that for several years. I won't go into that. I don't think I have time for that. That's fine. And what I want to stress is that if you are willing to let God take control of your life, it doesn't matter if you're qualified. Because God can open doors that you never would have imagined. So now that I've gone down that road, I kind of want to bring it back to perspective again from an arborist's experience. Okay? So as far as my 3 points in a poem go, here's a couple of points from an arborist perspective. Number one, take root where you are. No matter what life throws your way, assume that God has everything in control. Because there is a heck of a lot of things that you don't see that God does. And I'll get into some scripture in a little bit. Maybe a little bit later. While I've said I've followed God's plan, I've also been through a lot of things where I really felt like God had forgotten me, or where God had put me way over what I was qualified for, and felt like I was by myself. Part of that is 10 years of infertility. Now, if you've ever been with or around a couple dealing with infertility, you know it stirs up a lot of emotion. But Carmen and I went through over 3,650 days of wanting kids, but not being able to have them. Okay? That's a long, long time. 10 years is where we were. And after 10 years, you kind of, you learn to cope with the grief. And here's some things that I want to share with you out of that hardship. Because now, I'm on the other side of that. We have Josiah. You've seen him running around like crazy. He's absolutely fantastic. More than what I ever could have asked for. But there were a lot of times in my life where I felt like if God was in control, he was doing a horrible job. But I felt that way because I was looking at it from my perspective. There was a lot of moments where we felt the weight of the world all over the place. Stress with just life, with work, with everything else. And in those moments, if we didn't have God, things would have been totally different. But after a while, we got to this point of, it's like, okay, God, I'm going to ignore what's going on in life because you're a good God. I'm going to put that aside, and I'm just going to assume that you're in control, that you're doing this for a purpose. We haven't received our healing. And you know what? We're just going to root where we're planted. So what we started, we went through meeting with other couples that went through infertility, and we started sharing the wisdom that we'd learned. We started walking with other Christians and other couples, giving them the advice that I'd wish that I would have heard previously, because it would have shaped my life. And out of that pain blossomed a lot of very cool things. The miseries and difficulties of your life are not to be mourned. They are to be celebrated. Those opportunities allow you to demonstrate the light of Christ. Oftentimes, it's not how or what happens to you, it's how you react to what happens to you. And that's one of the things that I've picked up along the way through all of my careers, is it's not about aptitude, it's about just attitude, right? Because I'm willing to do a lot more if I acknowledge that I'm not qualified. I'm just willing. And the way that changes your attitude with others is fantastic. I've seen it all the time as an arborist, because I'm often, I see somebody doing something different, and I'm like, well, number one, I want to know why you're doing it that way. I want to know how to understand it. And if I see somebody doing something wrong, I often go up and I ask, hey, I've seen somebody else do it this way. Is there a specific reason that you do it that way? Like, is there some method to that? And it's funny, because when I approach it in a method like that, it's not, hey, you're doing something wrong. It's, wow, I've never thought about doing it that way. Or, you get somebody that says, well, I know how to do it that way, but sometimes I get lazy. Or I know that, this group of people does it that way, but here's this beautiful little piece of knowledge that I've learned in 30 years of experience. And it's just like, wow, it opens up doors to tease out some of those details. Okay, I'm running out of time very quickly. Some other things that I've learned as an arborist. Stand tall and proud. Everyone has something to offer, even if it's their first day on the job, right? As somebody who's been through so many careers, I've learned a lot that probably don't relate to whatever industry I'm in, but I look at the world from a different perspective. I see somebody doing something, and I thought, well, have you tried it this way? Because that might speed things up. Or, I look at the world differently because I come from a different side of things. Sorry, this is the portion where I'm flying by the seat of my pants because it's not on my notes. I think I gain a lot of respect from the people at work because I acknowledge that they have value no matter how long they've been there. I had a guy that came in, now with the current economic issues that we're having, we have a lot of people that don't come from an arborist background or a landscaping background. They come from an electrical background or a carpentry background or a driving background because they've been trucking. Because we're always looking for work, and if somebody shows an aptitude or an interest in learning, we're happy to teach. But they come with a set of experience that is totally different from what we've been, accepting. It's not always that's just the way I do it because that's how I was shown, and that's all the way I've done it all the time. right? And I've run into that type of attitude. Yeah. So stand tall and proud. Okay. I don't want to go this direction, but God has taken me in anyway. When I say stand tall and proud, obviously I'm doing that from a perspective of 6'6". I'm already tall to begin with. However, a lot of you have probably been in places where you haven't felt tall or proud, where you've probably felt like a failure. And if you allow that perspective to control your direction, God is limited in what he can do. Okay? There's a couple of interesting studies that God just brought to my mind. Kind of makes me wish I'd pulled pictures together, but that's fine. One was an artist who liked to play with perspective. He took piles of trash and arranged them in certain ways so that when you shine a light on it, the shadow that's cast on the back of the wall shows a picture, which I thought was a beautiful representation. Now, if man can turn something beautiful into trash, imagine what God can do. Another one was, it was actually a study that I saw on a TED Talk where they took a bag of trash in one neighborhood and they tagged every piece of garbage with a GPS locator and watched what happened with the magic. And it was a really neat experience because they showed, they have this GPS map and you can see it, okay, it's picked up here, and then they speed it up and it's like driven around the city, and then it's like split up and into like a couple of other dots. And then it's, the map just expands and expands and expands to capture the movement, because all of a sudden you've got a tin can that ends up in a metal refinery that, goes into this product. And they literally followed it all the way out. And what happens out of this one bag is a global map, because that bag of garbage actually ended up touching 4 continents and I think it was 17 countries. Out of a bag of garbage. Again, something man can do, imagine what God can do better. Sorry, guys. Have patience with me. I'm actually going to a piece of scripture that wasn't in my notes that fits with this. But to those of you who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence, but of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, that as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Sorry for that. That was something I had actually ignored and then just passed over, and went in a different direction, but that's fine. God can do amazing things if you are willing. And I'm going to keep repeating that because I've learned that with repetition comes memory. So if you feel like you have nothing of value, if you feel like you're a failure, if you feel that you have nothing of value to add, guess what? God has done much worse with much less. Use me as an example, right? He's opened doors for me that I never would have thought possible and given me opportunities that I never would have imagined, all because I said, yes, God. Get to enjoy the view from where you are. It's all about perspective, remember. If you're having a hard time in life, remember that the higher you generally go, the further and better you can see. If you're in a really tough spot, choose to follow God's perspective. And sometimes it may look like, you know what, I don't even know what this looks like to you. To me, this looks like garbage. But learn to ignore those negative connotations, those, you know what, I have nothing to offer. I am nothing. Because God can still use you no matter what. Psalm 33, verse 13 to 15. He fashions their hearts individually. He considers all their works. The Lord looks from heaven and sees all the sons of men. From the place of his dwelling, he looks on all the inhabitants of the earth. The higher you generally go, the further and better you can see. From his viewpoint, he can see every person on the earth, can divide bone and marrow and soul and spirit. He knows your thoughts. He can count the number of hairs on your head. And for some of us, that's dwindling as we get older. And some of us, it's turning gray, but that's okay. Where we see the world right now isn't reality, it's perspective. God's reality is much, much cooler. And I'll give you a hint, because we can't often see the knowledge of God. Job 28, verse 24, for he looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. I asked God to show me some really cool thing about perspective one day. And at the time, I was eating grapes. And he's like, do you have any idea how many people are connected to that grape that you're eating right now? 2? I picked it up from the store. Somebody probably put it on a shelf. And he's like, here, let me show you something cool. And so in my mind, I had this vision of following it from where I picked it up all the way back to its source. You know, from the face of the guy who put it on the shelf to the guy who took it from a box and took it off of a truck, to the truck driver who actually drove it from a distribution center, from the 2 guys that moved everything around in a distribution center and the other truck driver that drove it all the way from south of the border to another distribution center down there. And God started, giving me names and faces, and I wish I could have written it down. But it was absolutely fantastic because I got to watch this one object, which is a grape, all the way back to, and God was giving me these little details. This truck driver, he's like, I just helped him fix his truck last week. To the farm where it came on, and there was about 5 migratory workers. It's like, these are the guys that actually took it off the bush. This lady over here actually washed it and put it in a container for you. And, right down to the point of, and see this little spider by this branch? It actually caught 2 insects that would have eaten this had it not been there. And I'm like, when you start to look from God's perspective, it changes everything. Right? As far as I was concerned, I bought it from a store and I didn't care where it came from. God's been working with that farming family for 3 generations. God's perspective is far greater than anything you can possibly imagine. Everything is connected. And whether you believe it or not, you are powerful in how you move and how you make decisions. Everything you do is a reflection of the kingdom. And so when you walk into a store and you smile at a cashier, or you see somebody having a bad day and you ask them how they're doing, that's you operating in the kingdom. And that's how you can initiate change. Right? That's evangelism 101. Being an evangelist doesn't mean that you have to stand in front of a crowd. Being an evangelist means that you have to start with caring for somebody else. That's all it requires. Take an interest in other people. I did this once, and I have this habit. If somebody's wearing a name tag, I usually, like for cashiers is great because they always have name tags. I was in a dollar store one time, and there was a Muslim woman that was doing all the cashier work. And, so while she's ringing things in, I looked down and I saw her name. And then, she, finished our transaction. And, I looked at her in the eyes, and I said, thank you. I can't even remember what her name was. This was like a decade ago now. Now, there's a little bit of the backstory. She's wearing a hijab, and she had a lot of face scarring, to the point where most people probably, if they had paid attention, it was very obvious. And a lot of people, I can generally assume, probably wouldn't even have looked her in the eyes because it was like, something that somebody would draw attention to or be afraid to draw attention to. And so when I looked her in the eyes and I said thank you and I acknowledged her and I looked past that, you could see she was just startled. Now, she kind of like said thank you and then went back and then was like, whoa, did you just acknowledge me as a person? Like there was a connection there that God used to acknowledge her existence. Now, I have no idea what happened to her after that. I've never seen her before or since. But I trust that God had worked something in her life. Because by the time I walked out of there, she was almost in tears, and so was I. In that moment, God had moved in a powerful way. And I didn't have to preach. I didn't have to evangelize. I just had to look past her difficulty and acknowledge her. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your path. Never forget that you have power, even when your perspective is telling you differently. I heard a story one time, and I'm going to wrap this up really quick, It was a writer who was writing a book, and he loved to ask people how they came to Christ, how they heard and how they changed their life around. And so while he was having this conversation one time, it was with a gentleman who said, I was actually traveling through Sydney, Australia, down this one little street, George Street, I think it was. And I had this little old guy with white hair pop out of a doorway and said, "Do you know where you're going when you die?" And he's like, it startled me at the time, but the more I thought about that question, the more I was drawn to asking it and trying to figure out an answer for it. And, it's just like as this writer kind of kept asking people, it was like this story kind of kept unfolding. He was telling it to a church, and the guy in the back said, that same story happened to me. And the more he was asking this question, the more he was running into this story of this little white-haired guy from George Street in Sydney, Australia, who had asked this question to the point of he was actually talking to a U.S. naval chaplains group. And he asked this question of how many people had ever seen or kind of introduced, been with this small white-haired guy from Sydney, Australia on George Street. And about 30% of the entire group of chaplains said, "That's the reason I'm here." And it was like, okay, this is absolutely mind-blowing. I have to go to Sydney, Australia, to George Street and see if I can track this guy down. Because there are chaplains all over the place that have made this decision based on that small white-haired guy. Anyway, so he went, and he walked up and down George Street and couldn't find this guy anywhere. And so he pulled one of the shop tenders aside, and he said, "I keep hearing this story about this small white-haired guy down here that asks the question, do you know where you're going when you die?" He's like, "Oh yeah, he's been around for years. He's actually not here today. He's sick. But here's his address. Here's his information." And so that's awesome. So he went to go, knocked on his door. 95-year-old guy, tiny, frail little guy, white hair. And he's like, "Are you the guy that asks this question?" He's like, Yeah, I've been doing it for about 40 years now. And he's like, "Do you have any idea of the impact you've made?" And that little white-haired guy said, "Not a clue. I've been asking it for 40 years because it was something that was on my heart that God led me to. And you're actually the first person to come and talk to me." I'm like, 40 years, you've impacted an entire generation. You probably have 500 chaplains and pastors that you've encouraged, and not one person has ever talked to you. I mean, dedication, that's fantastic. But that's perspective, right? Your perspective is not God's. And if you feel like trash, God can still use you no matter what. Yeah, I'm out of time, so we're gonna finish there. Why don't we pray? Lord, I thank you that you have made it a mission to use us that are willing. And I pray that you would spark something in this generation, that you would spark something in this congregation and in those people that are listening and watching. Lord, that you would light a fire inside of them to ignore results, to ignore what the world says, and just to follow you no matter what. And I pray that you would bless that congregation and that you would give them examples and opportunity to walk in you, to walk in your power, to follow you wherever you go. And to recognize that even when you feel like a failure, God is still working in your life.